O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the storm.
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are discussing the rise and the spread of the first major Islamic empires and their impact on Western civilization and what we can learn from them about living a life that's pleasing to the Lord and living with others in a way that honors Him. So we left off last time talking about the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s.
476 is the date typically given in textbooks for the fall of the Western.
Right. So that's the last major thing, at least in Western history, that we see. And then starting, I'm not sure exactly what's going on between that time and the rise of Muhammad. I know that there was most likely we know the Byzantine Empire was flourishing at this time.
Yep, under Justinian is probably one of the most well-known Byzantine emperors. He took over in the first part of the 6th century, so early to mid 500s is when he ruled, and he had a vision of taking back the Roman Empire, and he actually managed to conquer, bring back Italy into the empire a bit, North Africa, even parts of Spain. So there was this vision of bringing it back, and they say that was kind of like the height of the Byzantine Empire, but as we go forward we see that wasn't to last very long.
Right. So we have that empire flourishing, and then in the correct me if I'm wrong, it's the 600s, early 600s when Muhammad comes into
So Muhammad's life was supposedly, all this stuff is roughly dated at this far back, but supposedly 570 to 632, when he was 40 years old, in 610 was when he had his first vision that he claimed to have, and so that was, I guess, the very start of Islam. And it wasn't until about 630 that all of Saudi Arabia was unified under him, and it started to expand beyond that.
Okay, so let's go into first of all, I guess we should talk a bit about the background of his peoples that were living there in Saudi Arabia at the time. Like, what were they like? What was their religion like? What was Muhammad dealing with when he began his religion in that area of the world? Yeah,
so that area of the world was a very mixed bag. He was basically from like a tribal people. So there were the Bedouins. I don't think he was Bedouin. He was a merchant that actually lived and grew up in Mecca. But you have this whole area where they do a lot of trade based on where they are. So they're seeing a lot of different people come through, but it's very much a tribal mentality. You do have different tribes that are just like nomads pretty much with their horses. But then also, like I said, there's a lot of people coming through, and you get a lot of the exiles from Christianity that were heretics coming down there. So these are the type of... This would be how Muhammad would understand Christianity, is just through the various heretics that come down to Saudi Arabia, because that was one of the acceptable places for them to go to get away from the Christendom, I guess you would say.
What kind of heretics were they?
So you have a couple of the big ones at that point are Monophysitism, which is, I don't know if I said that right. Basically, they say Christ didn't have two natures; he only had one nature. So I think they were saying that Christ is only divine, and somehow too that affects his death on the cross, how it didn't actually happen, or something weird like that. And then I forget exactly. Maybe you'll remember what it is. Nestorianism was a thing cropping up at that time.
Yeah, but I forgot what it.
All I remember about that was that Nestorius didn't actually believe in Nestorianism. So I thought that was kind of funny, but that was a heresy that if I tried to remember it, I'd butcher it.
Was another one about Jesus?
It was. Yeah, a lot of this is about Jesus and his divinity, how exactly he related to people, and his nature. People. That was the big issue at the time.
Right. So Muhammad, we know from his writings that he believed Jesus was a legitimate prophet of God. So he at least had that respect.
Yeah, he did.
Jesus.
I mean, if you look at the Quran and the stories because a lot of people say like, oh, they have a lot of similarities, like the Bible and the Quran, but really the Quran it goes through and Muslimizes a lot of the Christian stories and makes them, goes through and makes Moses, Abraham, the various prophets that he mentions, Jesus. In fact, he says they were Muslims. And with Jesus, you see, it would be below a prophet to be crucified. So he actually switched places, and depending on which one you go with, either Judas switched with him and was crucified for him, or Thomas, the twin, switched with him and was crucified. And I think you see too, his Christian knowledge is very poor in claiming these things, that have no historical basis and have been pretty well documented for the last 500 or 600 years. One thing that comes up is, and they obviously people try to work their way around it. He does claim that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the sister of Aaron, because if you think of Aaron, his sister was Miriam, and so Moses is referred to as Jesus' uncle.
Wow.
So you see. Yeah, he did not have, especially where he was, and where it was largely a pagan society, but you're getting the crazies of Christianity.
Right.
He did not have a good understanding, and even as he, if you think of Islam, it's one, one God. We worship one God. There's no other ones. As he rejected Christianity as a polytheist religion because of the Trinity. I think part of this was that the people that were down there that would be arguing for Christianity were completely unable. They didn't understand or have a good idea of who Christ was.
Right.
And so they didn't have any good arguments for actually it's not polytheistic. God is one. It says that very clearly. But yeah, so you kind of have that background religiously and where he is.
The Arabs down there, like Muhammad, they were mostly polytheists, right? They worship many gods.
I heard a couple of things. There's debate on that, but they definitely, I guess it was more, the debate was if it was polytheist like we typically think of pagans, or if there was already, Allah was already a god there. He didn't just it wasn't just a fresh god.
That's a fact, or that's
debated? Yeah. No, Allah was, there was
just the creator.
There was a god in their pantheon, if you call it that. I don't know, that was named Allah.
Gotcha.
And then there's debate over whether it was kind of like Allah and the other ones were kind of like lesser gods, or if it was just like a free for all. There's all different types of gods. Worship whichever ones you want.
Okay. So how did Muhammad begin his religion?
So supposedly in 610. He had his first visions, and he claimed the angel Gabriel came to him and said whatever the Arab word is for recite, to basically recite what he's saying. And so for the next 12 years, he's in Mecca, and I think his first convert was his wife, and then he gets a few other relatives, and at this point, he's very peaceful, and you can read the Quran, and you can tell very clearly the parts that were written when he was in Mecca compared to the parts when he was in Medina. So, like I said, he's in Mecca for 12 years, very peaceful, but by the time they kind of get tired of him, they're like, you're proselytizing an awful lot, we want you gone. So he gets exiled, and he goes to Medina, and he takes probably 100 followers, really not that many, especially considering what it would become in just a few years.
Yeah.
And in Medina, they're on harder times. Food is short, and this is when new revelations come to them that actually it's okay to raid, to turn to violence, in order to promote Islam. And so then you have the idea of jihad, and you see the religion really start to expand at that point, as people are like, oh, in the name of God, I can take what I want.
Right.
Like people like that.
Right. So after that point, he basically takes over Medina, right, and the area around.
Yeah. So
around Medina.
Yep, and then he actually goes back to Mecca, and there's a war with Mecca for a while until he, by force, takes Mecca. And as he takes it, basically he gives the people there a choice: is like, you can die or you can worship Allah and convert to Islam. And they're like, okay, we'll be Muslims.
Right.
And so then you see him in the next few years really consolidate to the point where all of Saudi Arabia is under his power and has converted, and that's when they start to come up north out of Saudi Arabia and look around, which they happen to come into a situation that is very ripe for the taking. You see the two major world powers of the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire.
Not hardly anyone has ever heard of the Sasanian Empire.
So basically, just think of Persia,
right.
the current name for what the Persian Empire is, and they had just gone through a terrible plague that is roughly equivalent to like the Black Death that most people know about. We were talking, they lost maybe a third of their population to this plague, and the Arabs were protected by the desert from this. And then also, simultaneously, they just had a 30-year war, and it's called the Last Great War of Antiquity, between these two world powers that just slugged it out, and they had this plague, and so they are completely exhausted. And this is the situation that the Arabs come up into as they're looking to expand.
So how did that expansion happen exactly? What were the major events?
So first they went east, and they basically toppled the whole Sasanian Empire in 2 years. By 634, it's gone, and it's all under Muslim control. So picture like basically where Iraq is, and they keep pushing east for a little while. They get all the way over to India. So that's 634, and in 636 was when the Byzantine Empire comes down with an army. The emperor is Heraclius, and musters up basically like his last army. He doesn't have much else to fight with at this point, and they come to the Battle of Yarmouk, and the Byzantines outnumbered the Muslims, but the commander of the Muslims outmaneuvers. Basically, he had a lot of cavalry, and he was very wise in his use of the cavalry.
Horsemen, for those who are uninformed.
And so in 636, they kill the Byzantine army to a man. I mean, there's people that escape, but for the most part, they kill them all. And
Yarmouk is in modern day Syria-ish?
Definitely ish. I'm not sure if it is. That would be a pretty good guess, though.
Okay.
And so then you see around this time that all that Syria area falls, Jerusalem falls, Antioch falls. All of this is in Muslim hands, and the Byzantine Empire is shrinking rapidly. They lose about half their lands. Egypt, they used to have Egypt, and shortly after this, the Muslims go over and take Egypt. And actually, the Egyptians were very much. They were more open to their coming. They were less interested in fighting and more welcome them.
Oh, okay.
Which is interesting considering that was really a cultural center point for the church for so long. How quickly it just accepts Islam. And some people point to the Arian debate. This is where Arius taught, and he was saying that Jesus isn't God.
Right.
And so the Muslim message there that Allah is just one and Jesus is just a prophet, it had some resonation with this still a strong group of Arian Christians in Egypt that are like, yeah, this is more like what we've been saying.
Arian so-called Christians.
Yeah, Arian so-called Christian, which I think is an important point to see as these areas, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, all fall to the Muslims, the mass conversions, and there were people that held out. There were Christians. God always has his remnant.
Right.
But for the large part, all those people that had, the types of people that had converted to Christianity because it was beneficial to them, now converted to Islam because now that's beneficial. And so I think you just see this kind of weeds out the fake Christians, I guess you could say. And they keep expanding west for a time. They get all the way up by 711. They have taken Spain. And that's kind of as far as they get with their expansion, which is quite a distance, really. Yeah. From the Atlantic Ocean, up into Spain, up into Europe, and then all the way over to India. Right. It's huge. That's rivals. I don't remember if they said which one was bigger, but it's bigger than the Roman Empire. Right. And I don't remember if they said this was bigger or the Mongol Empire was bigger a little bit later on.
Mongol Empire definitely.
But we're talking, thousands and thousands of miles.
Right. Yeah, we know that. Let's talk a little bit about while this is all going on, what's happening religiously and politically with the Muslims, because at some point we know that Muhammad dies. I think it was in 626?
632.
632 when he dies. So with his death, what happened? So he's the leader of these people who are making these invasions. What happens following his death with the leadership of the Muslims?
Yeah, so
empire.
So if you ever heard of the Shiites and the Sunnis, right? This is when that starts. So the Sunnis the Shiites believed that the next person in charge, whoever is in charge, should be a relation of the Prophet Muhammad, based on the idea that maybe more revelations will come. Yeah. That there's something in this bloodline. And the Sunnis are more like, it doesn't matter. Like, he was the last prophet. Nothing more is coming. We want a capable leader. And so this starts with, right away, they basically nominate and decide that the elite group there, that they're going to pick Muhammad's good friend Abu Bakr. And the problem with this is Muhammad had a cousin and son-in-law who was also very close to him, and he was not there for the nomination process because he was burying Muhammad. And so he gets back, and a lot of people had thought, like, natural selection right here, like, this guy could be the guy. He is related to Muhammad, and he wasn't even there for the process, and so he's not happy. And a lot of the people that would have supported him are also not happy. Yeah. And so you see that right there is where the divide comes up. But so this was Ali, was his cousin, and he does eventually kind of step down. But there's still that tension. And he does come into power later on. He's a younger man. But for the first few years, they're going through caliphs, which is what they decide to call their leader, who would lead their caliphate. They're going through caliphs very quickly. Like, they last a few years, and a lot of assassinations, a lot of infighting about who's going to be in control of this very quickly expanding empire.
And just a note about the word caliph, it just means successor. If you translate that to English, that's all it means. So they're kind of, it's very similar to the Roman Empire at certain points, where they're struggling for who is at the top. Yeah. Right? And there's infighting, there's assassinations, there's intrigue, and there's conspiracies.
Yeah. I did listen to an interesting thing where they went through and compared it right from the beginning to the end of the Roman Empire. They made a lot of good analogies in ways that, like, empire building happens, except for the Muslim one happened in like 50 years, where the Roman one happened in like 400 years.
Very, very rapid, and that's partly due to the plagues, to the fatigue from the wars, and the divisions among the former Romans, right? Yeah, they're divided into these smaller kingdoms, or they are just simply they're not ready for fighting. They're not strong. Whereas you have these people who have a relatively new zeal for this new faith that Yeah, let's talk about their motivations for expansion and invasion. It's pretty much the same as it's always been.
Yeah, I think when you boil it down, and you see this with the Roman Empire, that this was an empire that was built on, as you're drawing people in and saying, we can offer you this great prosperity based on, if we continue to conquer, we'll keep having booty, we'll keep getting wealth,
right?
And so that if you come and conquer with us, this could you get a piece of the pie, and this goes pretty well. Same with the Romans, it goes pretty well for a time, but then eventually you kind of reach your limits. You like with them, same thing with the Romans. You hit areas where it's going to be more work to take that than it's worth. I'm not sure if we could hold it. We've actually reached they reach the Chinese, they reach the Franks, that is the Muslims do, where there's more resistance than there has been, and it's a long way from home. Like, if you're gonna fight that war, you're not sure if you're gonna win. It's like, all right, I guess expansion's done. But up until then, they were able to provide a lot of wealth to the people fighting for them.
And not only that, but if they truly believed the faith of Islam, there's also for the men who fight, even if you die, obviously you're.
Yeah.
I'm not sure is it a promise that if you die? I think it is. It is a promise.
If you're going where you think it is.
In jihad, if you're fighting for Allah and Muhammad, that if you die for their sake, that for the spread of their religion, then you are promised basically a pleasurable eternity with earthly pleasures for eternity, at least for men. For the men,
40 virgins.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you do see in the accounts there is an extreme religious fervor that these guys are fighting with, that they don't have the technology yet that the Byzantines do. Like, if the Byzantines or the Sasanian Empire was at full power, like they wouldn't be able to stand up to them just based on technology alone. And they come and they're roughly equal with them, and they're not quite technologically matched, but they have a hunger in them that these other guys don't.
Right.
That they're more like they're more tired out, I guess you'd say. And these guys are fresh. They're coming in and they've got this religious fervor. They're like, for God, and I truly believe that this is what I'm meant to do. And and I've been told that if I go fight for my God, great things are going to happen for me.
Right.
So I'm going to do it. And if I die, even better.
Right. And so, but that's, I believe in Islam, that's the only. Isn't that the only promise that you will have a eternity in paradise if you die in jihad? Because
I'm not sure.
Otherwise it's uncertain. It's up to Allah. He's just gonna leave your fate up to reveal your fate to you.
Yeah, and I know it's very much based on just good deeds. If your good outweighed your bad, or something very simple like that.
Right. Although there is. I'm quite certain there is a teaching in Islam that it's basically the doctrine of uncertainty about your eternal fate.
Yeah, and like you said, it is up to Allah. I mean, I was telling you earlier with Muhammad, after they say his name, after a Muslim says his name, they say a phrase, and don't quote me on this, but it basically means, "May Allah be merciful." Yeah. Like, they don't even know if Muhammad makes it, and they're just may Allah be merciful to him, because it's up to Allah, who is very much not like the Christian God, in that the Christian God is very relational, very personal. He loves us. Allah is the supreme being, so much further above us, and we are mere ants in His sight, and we try to do good, and at the end of the day, may He be merciful on us.
Right, because He can change His mind. He's capricious. And He's a lot like us.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about next, what was the treatment of the Muslims toward specifically Christians and Jews, and if you want to go into the pagans in the lands that they conquered, how did they treat them? What was the relations like? What did they have to do? What was their policies? when they invaded these territories that were mainly under at least nominally Christian rulership.
So first, as they conquered, they were very, very much, would come in with the sword. If during the battles they would use some brutal tactics, they're very much into fear tactics. The Battle of Yarmouk, they beheaded 3,000 Christians, put them on spears, and paraded them around to try to get fear into the enemy. And then they brought another 1,000 Christians out, kneeled them down in front of the lines where they could see them, and slaughtered them right there. So very much into fear tactics, and they used that in many of the battles. So then a lot of times after the battle, basically taking the city and plundering it was fair game. Kill whoever you want. But so say you've made it past that, and there are actually actual policies towards Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians, was the main pagan religion in Persia.
Right.
And their policy, so they were more kind towards Christians and Jews. They still viewed them as people of the book, is what they would call them, and they saw them as monotheists, kind of. There was a debate over whether or not Christians were actually monotheists because of the Trinity. But so they're like, well, they're better than pagans, and you were allowed to keep your religion. However, you had to pay a tax for being not Muslim. You, in some places, you would get a tattoo to mark you. You would very much be an inferior citizen. There were jobs you weren't allowed to have, like as being in government positions, and you were obviously not allowed to marry any Muslims. And so you see that this is. Oh, also there were rules too about church. Like church building, there no more churches were allowed to be built, and so tolerant, sort of, with very much encouraging people to convert to Islam. Oh yes, and you see, over time in a lot of places they were able to really winnow down the Christian, the Jewish populations into mostly Muslim. And then especially if you were a Muslim and you converted to Christianity, you could be punished with death. You weren't like, they basically like, we're not losing Muslims to Christianity. And so, and it also it varies too. Like a big empire, depending on who's in charge, you get some that are more tolerant and some that are less tolerant.
Right.
And so you see different places, like in Egypt today, there are still the Coptic Christians. They make up a good percentage. I think it's like 10% of Egypt that have right through have remained, just a remnant, a Christian remnant. But then you look in other areas, some of the other North African countries, and there's less than 1%, whereas like it was rooted out a lot harder. And there was probably a lot less of a central, like Alexandria was a big hub of Christian faith there. So it varies, and there was some tolerance, and it's hard to tell because it was so long ago and the different records and what they say. But yeah, it was definitely favoring Muslims, obviously.
Right. Yeah. It must have, just to think about that, it must have been obviously really hard to be under an invader like that. Although the thing is, unfortunately, with most of the Christians, they were simply nominal. They just claimed to be Christians. They didn't actually have true faith in Jesus. So it wasn't really.
But it makes you wonder, like today, if something were to happen like that in our country, and you get a lot of people that claim to be Christians. What would be left? And I guess even more just thinking more for each personal self. Yeah. Like making sure that like me and my family, like we would hold fast.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So, I don't know exactly when it was. By the late 600s, at the latest, you have the Muslim lands expanded from Spain to India.
So they took
basically.
Spain in 711.
Right.
Yeah. And then by like the so 717, they make it up to Constantinople, and they siege Constantinople. And there was actually supposedly a prophecy that within 100 years, of the Muslim faith, they would take over the whole world.
And Constantinople, just to remind everyone, that is the capital of the Byzantine Empire.
And so they're looking at this as being like, well, it's about 100 years, and we're about to take the capital of the Christian world, is how they view it. And so there's this really this feeling of destiny, and that, yep, once we take Constantinople, this is the biggest pocket of resistance left, and then it's going to be a Muslim world.
Now, question, was that prophecy from Muhammad?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
And so
because that'd be a contradiction if it wasn't from Muhammad, because Muhammad's supposed to be
I'm not
the
sure.
last prophet.
Either it was from Muhammad, and he was wrong,
right?
Or it was a non-Muhammad prophecy, in which case Muhammad wasn't the last prophet. Or I guess maybe they'd say he was the last prophet and it was a fake prophet that said it, and that's why he's wrong. I don't know. Okay. But so, they siege Constantinople, and Constantinople holds out, basically through the Christians that the Muslims had with them defecting to Constantinople. They put Christians in a key spot in the navy,
right?
Doing the boats, and they basically just rode into Constantinople and be like, we'd really like to join you guys. Mm-hmm. And then also
then they destroy the boats.
Yeah, well, they had Greek fire, which, I mean,
the boats.
Yeah, they destroyed the boats they brought in.
Yeah,
and then
because they were working for the.
And then the
Muslims.
Byzantine Empire had Greek fire, so they basically just destroyed the navy.
And Greek, what is Greek fire?
It's basically like they were able to make like this sticky tar type stuff that just burned and was very hard to put out.
Yeah,
and they had it designed so they had like flamethrowers of it.
Right.
And so they'd come up with their boat and they just shoot that all over your boat.
Yeah.
And there's not much you can do at that point. And so they didn't even know, like, they didn't know what hit them, how to handle it. Mm-hmm. And so basically they just destroyed the navy of the Muslims very quickly that way.
Yeah.
And when you're left with no navy against a city that has 3 sides of water, it's kind of hard to continue the siege because they can get in and out. And
not only that, but I remember hearing from eventually winter came.
Yeah.
And they were unprepared for the winter.
Yeah, it was a lot more north than the Saudi peninsula.
They had to leave because they were freezing to death or starving.
So you get that one, and then they're expanding. So that's right in the middle, kind of where their empire is. Mm-hmm. And then in Western Europe, they're expanding up into France, and you have the Battle of Tours, where Charles Martel and the Franks come down and basically annihilate a large raiding party, though it's still like the size of an army. Mm-hmm. And they also, the governor of Spain, or I don't know if governor is what they call him, but was with that group leading them, and they killed him. And so you basically get the Muslims there, like, all right, there's quite a bit of resistance here, and we've been set back quite a bit. And Charles Martel is a pretty wise leader, and
Martel means the hammer.
Yeah, Charles the Hammer, and also so that's Charlemagne's grandfather.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of stopped there, so just to know too how far they had come, like Tours, and how far they were coming up into France. They were almost to Paris, which is like kind of on the northeast part of France.
Right.
That had they been able to continue unchecked, and there's no reason to think they wouldn't have, looking at how they had continued to go.
Yeah.
We're looking at them just keep going right through Europe. Mm-hmm. But so they're stopped there, and then there's also the Battle of Talas, which is actually
or Talas,
however you say it. I apologize to anybody who knows these things much better than I. Which is kind of in like the Tibet region north of India, and they fight the Chinese there actually, and it's a major battle. The Muslims win, but for both sides, because the Muslims were expanding east and the Chinese were in a period where they're like, well, we could expand west. Mm-hmm. It's a serious.
And at this point, they're not Chinese yet, right? I'm pretty sure there's some
dynasty,
some tribe of Chinese, or the Mongols or something. I'm not sure. They call them Chinese. But.
But so basically that one is the Arabians win, and some of the captives they bring back actually knew how to make paper, and so that's how paper comes to the Western world.
Interesting.
But both sides...
Real paper.
Before there was real paper.
It was papyrus.
Yeah.
For the most
And
part.
so you kind of see God working even there a little bit. Always working.
Right.
But working there in that he brings his paper, and it's not for several hundred more years that the printing press comes, but obviously we'll get into how that's used.
But from that point they start making books.
Yeah.
Around that time in the with the monks in the monasteries.
Yeah.
Codex.
But even with the victory, it's far enough away from home. It was a big enough battle with enough resistance that the Muslims are kind of like, that's not worth it to go further than this. Mm-hmm. And so in this area too, expansion has stopped. So by the mid 750s, largely expansion's done.
Yeah.
And obviously they continue to try to cut into the Byzantine Empire, and they do. And later, several hundred years later, they push into they conquer Constantinople in 1453. They push into southern Europe. They've always got this dream of wiping out Christendom.
Right.
You see that. But for the time right now, expansion's done. It's a large empire, and about 750-ish and they enter a golden age.
Mm-hmm. And what's under what dynasty is that golden, or what dynasty is that called that was in that golden age?
So that one was let me see, I had it written down, but I can't find it, so I'll just do my best and probably butcher it. Abbasid, I think.
Oh, okay.
And so these were Arabs, but they had been in Persia for a generation. And this is important in that you get these guys that were way in the east had been more integrated with other non-Arabs than most of the other ones, because when you're that far east, there's not as many Bedouin tribesmen to go around. There's not as many Arabs. And so in order to get your food, in order to basically have all the things you need for life, you have to interact with the other cultural people there.
Yeah.
And in so doing this in a generation, they've become a little bit more tolerant. And their cultures have meshed a little bit more, whereas in other places the Arab culture has just destroyed whatever culture was there and has overtaken it. And so these are the guys that come in and they take charge through a civil war. They had a lot of civil wars, the Muslims did. And they take charge, and they realize that Persia is too far east to rule the whole thing. But they don't want to go all the way west again, because part of the reason behind the civil war was that Persia was so far east that the rulings coming from Syria and the Arab Peninsula were not even applicable to what they needed over in Persia. And so they don't want to go that far west and create the same problem again. And so they create a new city, Baghdad, which is more central.
Right.
And it's from there that they build libraries. They what is it? I think the House of Wisdom is the one they built. Yeah. And you get a lot of science and philosophy, and that stuff starts to flourish. Right. And it's about
so we there is a claim that the Muslims had good scholarship, that they were invested in the sciences, that they made scientific discoveries. And so is that true? Around this
time, to an extent, I would say their architecture, their philosophy was very much influenced by the areas that they conquered. That, if you remember, like, they were tribesmen, right? And they come in, and so their architecture looks very Byzantine. The think of the Dome of the Rock.
Right.
You look at that; it looks like a lot of Byzantine buildings.
Right.
And a lot of their philosophers are coming from the roots of Persian philosophers or Byzantine philosophers. But at this point, yes, these are converted. A lot of them are converted Muslims, though there are still like Christians and Jews that are participating in this, and they are encouraging it.
Right.
But it's not. But then you see the Golden Age kind of decreases, and you see the results for the next several hundred years after that is in about the 11th century. Some of the caliphs came to the conclusion that all this philosophy and science and stuff is outside of the Quran. We just want the Quran is all we need. And if it's not in the Quran, we don't need it. And so they start, outlawing very and discouraging, exploration in science, philosophy, and all that type of stuff, and you see this really hurts their culture. And you see specifically at this point, they were more powerful than much of Europe, and you see that start to flip to the point where in Europe under Christendom they have a movement called scholasticism going, and this kind of is like the roots of the Renaissance too.
Now, scholasticism, when does that start? In the early thousands or 11th century?
I think around then.
Okay.
I'd have to double check to see for sure. And this is basically saying that God is reasonable. We know that God does not change, and we can see all over the earth natural laws that He's put in order in ways that He's ordered things, and they make sense. And so by understanding that, we can make sense of the world. And you see this idea start to go on a lot of it's not till centuries later that we see a lot of things, but like Newtonian physics, right. And like in the Renaissance where you see
astronomy.
And you see these things where they're like, we understand that the world makes sense, we just have to understand it. That God makes things that make sense.
Right.
And in this, by the time you get to the Renaissance, colonialism, the Muslims are more of they're not technologically up to date, and you see Europe just as they're splitting up the world, just trouncing everybody because they've come a lot further technologically.
And I'm sure this switch back to the Quran and rejecting every other source of wisdom or knowledge, I'm sure what that meant for the Muslim policy toward non-Muslims was more severe. Now, they had been up to this point kind of tolerant, but then if you were using your own scriptures and other sources of wisdom, they're not going to tolerate you as much, and they're going to. And it's at this point
that a lot of the Muslim accounts that you can read, that you can find, are written actually at this time. And you see very much a violence, like a pride in that violence and in that just the Quran. And there's debate whether or not this is true, but a claim that the second Caliph Umar destroyed the Library of Alexandria. And again, there's debate over whether or not this is true, because the Library of Alexandria wasn't even mentioned in the histories for like 300 years before that, and it's like they think it was already destroyed. But in the story, they're saying that basically they're like, we have all these books, what should we do with them? And they go take them to the Caliph, and he's like, or they take this information to the Caliph, and he's like, well, use them to burn, use them for heat, for fires, and they because his words are basically like, well, do they aid the Quran in anything? And they're like, well, no. And he's like, okay, so burn them. And again, not that this is a true story, but this is the ideals that they're teaching at this time.
Right.
That if it's not in the Quran, it's worthless. And you, like I said, you just see them start to decline at this point. They're not, as a culture, I should say.
Right. And so, kind of, it's, I don't know if it was a deliberate reaction to this, but it's kind of, it seems like it makes logical sense that at this point, in the beginning of the thousands, that's when the crusades start.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you see the crusades start. The first one started in 1096, and we'll probably do an episode on the crusades. But a lot of debate on the crusades over if they were right, if they were morally okay to do, if they were successful in what they were trying to do, and what a lot of the impacts were over this. But certainly, it does coincide with the Muslim culture kind of being on the declining phase.
Right. So, at least in the beginning, the Crusades were successful in taking over some of the lands in modern day Israel.
Yeah, and repulsing, because the Muslims were threatening Constantinople. That was why the message was initially sent from Constantinople to the Pope, be like, you need to help us, because if we fall, you're in trouble. And the Pope sees this, and he's got different motivations for answering the call, but basically sees this and sends a whole bunch of people, way more than they expected, to go, and they pushed the Muslims down. And really, if you think of it in terms of Constantinople fell in 1453, and this was 1096, they could have bought them a few hundred years of, before Constantinople fell.
If the when they did what, the Crusades?
When the Crusades, yeah, the Crusades coming at that time, helped Constantinople not to fall for several hundred more years.
Right. Okay, well, let's just as we wind down here, you had, I forgot what you said. There was some like interaction between the Muslims and the Christians where they were...
Oh, at the Battle of Yarmouk, I think you're talking
about.
No,
iconoclasm.
Oh, iconoclasm. Okay.
Yeah, this kind of how their different cultures interacted with each other and how they kind of changed the Byzantine Empire a little bit.
So iconoclasm was the belief that you shouldn't have icons, you shouldn't have idols, you shouldn't have graven images.
Right.
And the Muslims were very big on this. You do not draw Allah. You do not draw Muhammad. And they were very big on this. And you see this rub off on the Byzantines. And the iconoclasm became a big thing where you have whole groups that say, we shouldn't be having any pictures of Jesus, any pictures of the Mother Mary, any pictures of the saints. So you have groups that when they come into power, they destroy these. And there are some points to that.
And basically, the way it worked was they looked over at the Muslims and they said they don't worship their God with these types of things. So it seems like a good idea not for us not to as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And which, like I said, I think there are some points to that. However, I think you see culturally the difference in them being close to the Muslims, and that in the West with the Roman Catholic Church, this wasn't a thing at all.
Right.
And so I think you see them very much, the Byzantine Empire, being affected by, like you said, like looking over and seeing how the Muslims were worshiping their God.
Mm-hmm. Right. So as we close down, let's just talk a little bit about what do we think, what were the outcomes of the Muslim Empire ending up the way it was, how big it was, like what was the Lord doing in his, as he works out history, as he controls history, in order to advance the truth? What do you think, Casey, that the Lord was doing through the Muslims, through the Muslim empires? I think
one of the big things he was doing was chastening the so-called Christians. I think you see it throughout the Old Testament with the Israelites, where they are the ones that claim to follow God, are supposed to be following God, but don't do it very well. And God sends in a nation that has nothing to do with him and conquers them, carries them away, or subdues them for many years.
Yeah.
And I think you see this. You see after the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius basically admits, like, this is, God's not happy with us. He had married his niece, and he said, and specifically, God's not happy with me for marrying my niece. That was wrong.
Now, I didn't ask you this earlier, but did he end up divorcing her?
I don't think he did.
So he admits it's wrong. But he says, I guess it's okay to just keep going.
Yeah, maybe he thought divorce was wrong too. I wasn't sure which one. No, I don't know. But so you see this empire with the Byzantines that I think had become a lot, and you see this in how many converted to Islam, had become a lot of fake Christianity.
Right. Well, we know even well before that it was very fake, but it was even worse now.
Yeah,
because it was basically Eastern Orthodoxy at this point, right? A lot of the roots of Eastern Orthodoxy were being practiced there.
And so I think God is chastening them, and then also I think he's building up a rival, because if you're in church and maybe you've never really thought of something, or something's not that important to you, then somebody comes up and they say something that is heretical. Suddenly that issue really gets pushed more to the forefront of your mind, and you start studying that. And so I think in a sense that's what he's doing for Christians at this time, is because they had, and not that they shouldn't have been trying to understand the Christ's relation to the Father, but now for a couple of hundred years they've been killing each other, like literally killing each other over infighting with who exactly Christ was.
Right.
And they've kind of lost sight.
Doctrinal differences.
Yeah, doctrinal differences, and they've kind of lost sight of the idea of spreading the gospel.
Right.
Trying to just a more simplified version of we need to reach everyone with the gospel and help everyone to have a deeper faith. When they get caught up fighting each other, killing each other over deeper doctrinal differences, which I'm not saying aren't important.
Right.
But they lost sight of that other stuff. And so I think the Muslims coming up is like, whoa, like this is not even Christianity. We've been fighting over various views on Christianity for a while, and something snuck up on us here.
Yeah. Right. And so that highlighted what they had in common.
Yeah.
Rather than what they have. I mean, obviously the nuances of how you understand Jesus' nature are important, but they're simply, you can't understand them fully. So at some point you have to give up and say he's just both God and man. And that's all that we can say.
I think too an application for this is kind of like, I think a lot of Christians today, it's a lot easier to argue doctrine with other Christians than to preach the gospel to unbelievers. And a lot of Christians fall into, that's the thing they do. They debate with other Christians,
especially on social media.
Yeah. As opposed to just preaching the basic message that Christ came and died for those who would believe in him.
Right.
And that's the message that so many people need to hear, where it's like, is it important to discuss doctrine with other Christians? Yeah. But that shouldn't keep you from, that shouldn't be more important than getting the gospel out.
Right. Yeah, I think an application that brings to my mind, at least in the U.S., is how divided Christians are. Evangelicals actually hold to the biblical gospel over those secondary matters where we keep apart from one another, or we engage in these every time we interact, we want to bring up these issues instead of uniting together in order to spread the gospel, in order to try to work out our differences and to try to, as much as possible, put aside our minor disagreements in order to unite for the true gospel. And so in regards to that, I see a parallel between back then and now, is that at least, well, it's for sure in the U.S., Islam is spreading.
Yeah, it's
spreading
in Europe a lot too.
Oh, it has.
I mean, they might be taking things over without having to fight.
France is largely very, very Muslim. So is Great Britain at this point, at least. I don't know any other countries, but I know it is definitely spreading in there. So we need to unite together in order to spread the gospel, like our Christian ancestors failed. Unlike our Christian ancestors failed to do.
I did want to also hit real quick on some Muslim doctrine a little bit, just on some of the differences.
Let's close with that.
All right. So one of the things that is very evident is, so as Muhammad, brought this forth, it's much more simple than the Christian doctrine. It's very, the idea is one God, worship him, follow these rules. Which I think for Christians infighting, I think probably some of that would have been a nice message to hear. And so you get some of that. However, in this you see violence and sex are encouraged.
Right.
You can, people that don't believe, you should
not permissible sex, obviously illegitimate sex, just giving in.
No.
Into
I guess I shouldn't say adultery is not encouraged. Not like that, but more fair game are the infidels. You can kill them, you can rape them, it doesn't really count.
Yeah.
You can marry several different women. If you want to divorce, for a man, it's very, very easy. And so basically you get these, the things that Christians would think are like the passions of the flesh are have outlets in Islam,
right?
And it's just like you just follow these rules, and you can participate in these things. So you see that, and so I think that gets part of the reason of the appeal to the masses of these Muslim people is that this is one where I get to just follow rules, and I don't have to think about it too much, and I can get what I want.
Right. But mostly for the men.
Mostly for the women. No,
for the women, it's kind of it's a lose situation.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. So then another thing that I thought was very key, and this is for not just Islam, but really any religion or cult that follows this pattern, is you see divine revelation coming through one man, and he said, after me, I'm the last one. After this, nobody changes it.
Yeah.
And by the way, this revelation just happens to me a lot of times when I'm alone in a cave. Whereas Christian revelation comes over thousands of years to several different people, sometimes very publicly,
right.
And it's very consistent.
In fact, most of the time, very
so looking at it, like, you can't have anybody that just because with Muhammad, how do you know? I mean, really, how do you know if he made it up? If Muhammad appeared, or if Gabriel appeared to him, if a demon appeared to him? You're just going based on his word.
He certainly doesn't have any attesting miracles like Jesus does.
But then with Christianity, which does have the attesting miracles, it's spread out over so many people. If you had somebody that claims, and you do have this in some of the fake gospels, people are like, this is the Bible, and you're like, this doesn't match any of the other scriptures, and so I'm thinking no. So just this divine revelation, which I think is much more, shows the power of God in Christianity in making all these different people line up to present a story and message that's so consistent and interwoven with itself, as compared to one guy alone, and gives a very contradictory messages right throughout. And how he answers this is the latest one is the update.
Right.
So it's allowed to contradict.
God can change his mind.
Yeah, God can change his mind. Whereas the Bible says that God can't change his mind, and somehow all these different authors agree.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very interesting difference. And then the big one is that Islam doesn't deal with sin. It doesn't look at people and say, you have sinned. It's more just try to be good and hopefully you make it. Whereas Christianity is like, let's be honest. Like, you have sinned. And one sin in the eyes of a holy God makes you guilty. Just like one murder would make you guilty.
Right.
Even if it was 15 years ago and you haven't done it since, you're still guilty. And so Christianity comes up with a way to deal with that sin, to say, it must be paid for. You don't just get off free.
Well, it doesn't come up with it. It actually does.
Yeah, you're right.
It does deal with it.
And so I think that's a major, major difference. And again, just with the simplicity of Islam, of just, there's one God, worship him, follow these rules, hopefully you get in.
Right. Not to say that Christianity isn't simple.
No.
The basic message of the gospel is simple.
And I think that's part of the divine brilliance of it, is that it's simple enough for a small child to understand.
Right.
And yet we're going to be studying it for our whole lives.
And for eternity.
And for eternity. And just be amazed at, wow, like another layer.
Right. Exactly. And that shows that it's divine.
I did have one more point that I thought was interesting about historically. I call it barbarian strength. These people that are hardened by, like, the Bedouin tribesmen are just like tribesmen in the desert, and you look at like the barbarians, just these guys that are hardened by a hard lifestyle, and you see civilizations constantly fall to these less technologically advanced people that are they're tougher. And just taking this and kind of like combining it with the religious fervor of these Muslims and kind of applying it to myself and to us as Christians is to try to have that type of zeal, and to not give in to a culture that makes it so easy to be soft. It makes it so easy to just take it easy, to not really study or pray or seek God very hard, to to give into a life of luxury instead of a life of discipline,
Right.
because that's the type of stuff that makes you weak Christians, makes you easy to take over by the world. And so just looking at that and being like, obviously you don't want to have everything in common with these guys, but that strength of discipline, of a hardened lifestyle, and one with a religious fervor that like, I will do anything for my God.
Right.
And just an encouragement to try to harness that.
Right. And you can have a hardened lifestyle without going out into the woods and living a self-sustaining
locusts and honey.
system.
No, I'm just kidding.
But it's about discipline.
Yeah.
It's about abstaining from your fleshly desires.
Exactly.
And following Jesus, imitating him.
Yeah.
And basically what Paul says in Romans 12 is, by the mercies of God, presenting your body as a living sacrifice.
Choosing every day to pick up your cross and follow him.
Right. Amen. And that's our encouragement to you, our listener, as we close this episode of the King's Hand in History podcast. I hope you've learned a lot from this and you've gained insight from it, and you will seek the Lord more earnestly and contend for the faith, but also join together with other Christians to spread the gospel. So until next time, thank you for listening, and God bless.